Hello Uganda, good evening and welcome to the show On the Spot. My name is Patrick Kamara. To many analysts, Uganda's economic trajectory seems to be good. Uganda is moving forward in the area of agriculture, but sometimes struggling in health and education. Uganda is also racing to achieve the middle income status. This country is not doing this alone. There are other multinational organizations that are helping Uganda, and some of them include the World Bank. And so my guest this evening is the country manager for World Bank. Ms. Mukami Kariuki, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
You are the country manager, World Bank. You've been around for about 4 years here in the country. As we extend a warm welcome on this show, but we also want to know how has it been like as country manager for an entity like World Bank in Uganda?
It's been a very interesting time here. I arrived during COVID and after the last elections, and so it was a time when there was a lot of reconstructing, reorganizing to do in terms of getting our office back into shape. In other words, people had been out of office for almost 2 years, so we were moving back into the office, and as well as trying to reconnect with government. So that was quite challenging in COVID times, but it was very useful to have a new group to start moving forward with that had the same agenda as us, which was to really try to rebuild the country. And so we then set out to try to see how we could support that effort. Were immediately challenged by several pandemics, Ebola as a second one coming after COVID, but also Mpox and Marburg that sort of affected the health sector. I think we were well prepared because we had an emergency health project in play, and that then provided the support that government required for all of these pandemics and other health emergencies. Wow,
you arrived quite in the middle of something really difficult, especially COVID-19. But to be very fair for our viewers, because I assumed as if everybody knows Mukami Kariuki, so let me ask exactly if you can just give a little background, because if you walked on the streets of Kampala, we'll just look like my elder sister somewhere, my cousin. Who is Mukami?
Mukami. I'm Kenyan. I have been actually working for the World Bank for a significant period of time. I won't tell you the exact number of years, but in that capacity I've then had the opportunity to work across the world. We are required as international staff to move to different countries and regions. So that has taken me to, of course, Washington, to the Philippines, and to South Africa, Zimbabwe. I've tried to stay as much as possible within the continent, and also to Tanzania as postings. But of course, in those various postings, I've had to work in countries within those regions as well. I should say that I have a long history with Uganda. My parents, my father went to school here at Makerere.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he got his master's in mathematics. I think he was the first one in East Africa while he was here in Makerere. And my parents got married at the chapel at Makerere University.
St. Francis, I suppose?
Yes. So, okay. So I think there's a lot of history for me in Uganda. And I started working in Uganda in the early 90s from a posting in Nairobi, which was an Africa-wide position in the water sector. So I worked quite extensively with NWSC before moving on to Washington. My second time working with Uganda was when I became manager for the Urban and Water Program in Africa East from Washington. And so Uganda was one of the countries that I supported in that capacity. So I have done several stints here, and so coming here to live was quite exciting, in that in the previous times I had been here, I had only come and left on missions.
So you are literally posted home?
Yes, literally.
They almost sent you home from DC to Uganda, the country you've had an experience with, where your parents got married here and your father was at the university here. I mean, you were literally home.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the proximity is one thing, but I think obviously being an East African, it's home in that sense as well. The proximity to Nairobi also was useful in the sense that I got to see family more often, so I could pop over there and check how things were going, and then back to Uganda.
As a World Bank country manager, being posted in Uganda, maybe say this was one of the best postings you got. I would say that it was one of the good postings. It was a challenging post. I've had good postings all along, so I've appreciated every one of them. The opportunity to work in different countries is one of the blessings that we get as bank staff. Each one offers you very different experiences, and you learn a lot, and you're able to then engage with the people in those countries and to see from their perspective how the bank can be helpful in making things happen. Now, talking about the bank, as a World Bank as a developing partner for Uganda, in what sense does actually the World Bank interact with Uganda? What programs do you really support? What exactly do you do? Yeah,
so we like to see ourselves as a financier as well as a knowledge provider. So we call ourselves a knowledge bank, and we also have the IBRD, which is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the first entity that was established to provide support across the globe after the Second World War. I was going to say the last one, but there have been others since. But World War, yes, the last World War. And we then set up IDA, which is the International Development Association, to provide funding to countries that were developing and didn't have the ability to borrow on commercial terms. So that window has been the one that Uganda has benefited from. It typically provides credits, but sometimes provides grants. And in the recent years, say almost the last 10 years, Uganda has received very favorable terms from IDA. 50 years to repay the loan with no collateral, no interest, and no service charge, and also the payments restart after 10 years. So that's very, very favorable, and we consider that to be almost a grant. 73% of it is grant by the time it has been repaid, if of course the resources are used for economic activities that generate the funds to turn over the monies such that...
So are you mindful to see that money is effectively utilized? Because at the end of the day, if you've given the money, even if it's 73% grant, it should be put where it is supposed to be. And do you also go to follow the money?
Yes, absolutely we do. We have what we call implementation support missions, up to 4 a year, where the team comes and works with the government ministries that are responsible for implementing the projects, to go out to the field, to see what's being done, to hear what the challenges are, so that we can work through those challenges with government and make adjustments to the loan terms and conditions as needed to make it possible for those projects to be implemented. Sometimes there are extensions required, sometimes the costs are not within the envelope, and so we look at all these things together with government to see how to help. But our ultimate beneficiaries, the Ugandan people, are the ones that we focus on, so we try to ensure that everything that we do reaches all Ugandans equally.
I know you stated that you know, the loans are long term and some of them are grants. Yes, they can be long term, but the critics would say that some countries like Uganda are indebted because of the loans that we get from multinationals like World Bank, that we get into the debt trap because the loan has always been you know, given to us, and at the end of the day it's not a good thing because we get heavily indebted.
Yeah, so I think what would have to be done is a look at the entire package of loans that are being received by the country to see where the debts are piling up, in the sense that, as I've told you, if you borrow for 50 years to do a project that might take you 5 years to complete, if that project is well implemented and you turn over the income from that project, within the 50 years you'll have had a huge revenue sort of boost to allow you to pay back those loans effectively. But if you borrow at terms which are more expensive for a project which is non-income generating, then of course you have the opposite outcome, which is that you're paying back from other resources which you don't have. So I think the terms that we provide are very favorable. They're intended to help countries that are developing to be able to make impacts in all sectors, from the social sectors to infrastructure. And I should say that one of the things that has helped is that the government of Uganda has asked us to focus our funding on infrastructure investments and not what is called soft funding. So that's money, for example, for capacity building.
You know, there's a tendency in Uganda where money is borrowed for a project and then a project maybe stalls for about a year or two and nothing is moving on, and yet perhaps the loan is picking interest. And sometimes money is taken back. There's something called lack of absorption capacity, and then you wonder, why would you in the first case even ask for the money if you didn't have the capacity to absorb it, or why didn't you utilize it? I wonder whether in the loans you've given, you've made something like that.
Yes, absolutely, except that there is no interest charged on our loans at this point. But we do still want to make sure that even without that, we have the impact that's required. So where those problems emerge, we discuss with the government. Sometimes we cancel the loans if necessary. Other times we repurpose them. For example, if the priorities have changed or funds have been obtained from somewhere else to do a task, we then repurpose those loans to allow other priorities that have materialized to come through. And there are quite a number of reasons for these types of delays. Sometimes a contractor may abandon site and the government then has to go through the process of trying to find somebody else to come on board. Sometimes a disaster might strike and the infrastructure is damaged and some work has to be done to repair it. So we work through all of these issues with government to see how best to utilize the funds to have that necessary impact.
There are some cases, Mr. Mukami, where you find that the loan has been given, but as if the government entity has not been ready at all. And then you wonder, is there somebody who gets a commission when a loan is given?
No, these are public resources.
Okay.
So the public resources are intended to meet public priorities, and our policies do not allow for commissions to be provided. So therefore we do what we call an institutional assessment at the start of projects to try to make sure that there's readiness. If there are, for example, insufficient staff, we would work with the government to try to find ways to make sure that the staff that are required to implement the project are hired in, or firms are hired to help with those tasks which don't have sufficient capacity on board. I'll give an example of the Greater Kampala Metropolitan Area project, which is ongoing. Engineers, resident engineers were required because the focus of those projects is largely roads and drains, and many of the municipalities in Greater Kampala did not have those engineers. Government then seconded them from the Public Works Ministry to those municipalities because we had a requirement that before any works could start, they had to have capacity in place, and they did this in those municipalities.
Yeah, but you know, the road project, for example, sometimes a road can stall because the money has been acquired, but they don't have a right of way. Probably perhaps the project affected persons in some cases have not been compensated, or maybe somebody says, no, I don't want that compensation, I'm so attached to my land, I would want something more than that. So how do you deal with something like that? Because you have money that you want to give for a project, but perhaps the project affected persons are not in agreement with the government.
So typically we ask that the government clears the right-of-way before the contracts start. So the project can start, but the right-of-way have to be acquired before we can start, get the contractor on board and allowed to work. And this is to stop the delays that you talked about earlier. But of course, as you said, there are always some cases, and in those cases we try to have mediation discussions with the government. The government is the one one that compensates. The bank does not pay for compensation of PAPs, so that is usually the government's contribution to the projects, is to pay for project affected persons, or PAPs as we call them. So yes, we do sometimes have those delays, but we do have also arrangements. So in the roads and bridges project that you may know about, which is Koboko Yube Moyo, 40% of the right-of-way had to be acquired before they could start. So they would be able to start that 40% while they're acquiring the next stretch. So obviously government has its own rules around handling PAPs, and so we have to work with them to align our policies and government's policies to ensure that compensation is paid as necessary for those that are affected severely.
So when you look back, probably maybe 5 or 10 years back, I wonder how much money has been injected in Uganda and whether you can see the dividends.
So we are currently at about $4.7 billion. That's in our books, but this number changes on an annual basis because some projects exit, others enter the portfolio. So when I joined, it was 5.1 billion, and I think by the end of this year it will be back up to maybe 5.2 billion with the projects that are being negotiated now. And what we do is we monitor the projects on a regular basis. As I said, we have the implementation support missions. They prepare a report, and based on that report we make adjustments as necessary, including through a midterm review. We do expect the client and client also including beneficiaries to let us know where the shoe is pinching. So we have grievance redress mechanisms, so if there are problems emerging in those projects, we hear about them early on and we can work towards resolving them.
As World Bank, when you're providing support for Uganda, do you bring this money to support projects that you think about in Washington, D.C., that maybe Uganda needs this, or this support is supposed to align with the Ugandan programs?
No, we work from the government script. So typically the National Development Plan, in this case there's also the tenfold strategy, there's Vision 2030, and we work with governments to define what the bank's best contribution to the country is. So we don't pick everything, because obviously there are other partners who are supporting other priorities. So we would then identify those projects which are best suited to our funding and which government would like to borrow for to support those activities.
Are there cases where you find the choice of programs or projects Uganda has chosen sometimes do not align with the interests of the bank, and you're like, this one we can do?
Yes. And we are, of course, very transparent in our discussions with government, what we can and cannot do. Government is a member of the World Bank, shareholder, and so it has been instrumental in shaping the policies the bank uses, and so it's something that we're quite comfortable doing with government, is having a discussion on alternatives that we can swap. So if this is not fundable, what can we do instead? There's a big agenda, so it's not so difficult. You have
of mind what you know probably that was not aligning, and you're like, this one we can't do?
So for example, there are certain things like force account, where government uses its own equipment and staff. Sometimes those are not, that is not an approach that is acceptable. The bank typically likes to try to support the private sector, to develop the private sector in a country, and so we work through competitive bidding to allow both national and regional and international contractors to come in, those who are qualified and have the skills to do the job. So yes, those are the types of things that have been faced. In certain cases we've been asked to procure items which we don't procure, so we've not been able to do that. And so maybe an example of that would be equipment which is then used for purposes which are not aligned with the development agenda, so we then cannot procure that type of equipment.
You're also working in a country where many would say there is an integrity deficit. I'm talking about corruption. How have you tried to navigate that issue of corruption in Uganda, because you're dealing with money, and money can eventually be deployed to do something, but because of corrupt tendencies, money can get abused or misused?
So again, our procedures require us to be quite diligent in trying to help to make sure that procurement is done in a transparent manner. But we also then work with the government to set up systems in the projects to help. So the Dr. DIP project, as we call it, it's a development response to displacement project focusing on refugee hosting districts. That project had the IGG as an instrumental player to monitor the activities at the local level and make sure that there was no issues emerging which were either fraud or corruption related. So when they found those, they then dealt with them, and I think the project was quite successful in addressing most of the issues that were found. But there are cases where we don't find out about these until later, and in those cases the government then is required to find a way to restitute the issue, and in some cases we declare the funding ineligible if it's been used for purposes which it was not intended.
Talking about refugees, Uganda has been commended for its policy on refugees, and in some cases, I think in Western Nile region, the number of refugees is almost the same as the number of the host community. But do you really know, as World Bank, the figure of refugees in Uganda? Because at the end of the day, they'll be getting support from the World Bank, but you need to determine the numbers.
So we work very closely with the other UN agencies and of course with the ministry of that's responsible for refugees to try to assess the numbers and to make sure that whatever we're doing is aligned with not just the refugees but the hosts. So we have a window for hosts and refugees which provides funding. And that funding is supposed to go equally to both parties to ensure that we build social cohesion and that we are not providing support to refugees that the hosts are then disadvantaged as a result of not receiving. So we do have numbers which the players who are quite involved in this matter, UNHCR is the main one, and of course there are others, IOM, and that are involved in helping to count. They're using a figure now of about 1.8 million refugees, and so we have stepped up significantly our support for the refugee hosting districts, and our funding now is about $960 million, most of it grant funding that is going equally to support the hosts and refugees. So I'd say to an extent that Uganda has benefited from the fact that we are providing these grant resources to the districts that are hosting refugees. The model is now changing and shifting so that we will have 50% grant, 50% credit, but to the extent that the government's policies about refugees are followed through, building self-reliance and trying to get them to have more contribution to the economy, then these will be good investments.
But I don't know, I also know you're very passionate about the environment, but if you go in some of these refugee hosting communities, because of the scarce resources and how they're surviving on forests and I mean on natural resources. For example, the forest cover is getting depleted in Western Nile region because people are using methods that are not sustainable. I don't know what's your take as a bank on to have 1.8 million people come to a place that could decimate the natural resources.
So as I said, we have the $960 million. It is spread across the 17 projects that we have. I think maybe it's in about 15 now. And each of those projects had different objectives. So we have a project called Investing in Forests and Protected Areas. And in that project, there's a refugee hosting component, which is helping to build, to recover the forests, but also helping to provide woodlots that would then provide the fuel that is used by refugees. So these are the types of efforts we make. There's a water project which is also helping to provide some of the support in terms of water resources, and similarly across the board we have roads, electricity, digital support that goes into these districts. But the Investing in Forests and Protected Areas project has a specific objective in that regard. And the Climate Smart Agriculture project also is looking at climate impacts and trying to see how to support the refugee hosting districts so that they are sustainable in the long run.
Madam Mukami, about 100 years back, former British Prime Minister, when he came to this country and was dazzled by the beauty of Uganda, he called it the Pearl of Africa. And 50 years back, perhaps the forest cover was half of this country, but the forests are dwindling. The forest cover is reducing at an alarming rate because, let's face it, whoever is going to have dinner tonight, that dinner, 90% or more will be prepared either using charcoal or wood. And that's not sustainable. At a World Bank level, does that concern you as World Bank, that Uganda and other African countries really, we are probably in a self-demolition mode?
Obviously it does concern us because from a climate perspective as well, tree cover is important. But from a sustainability and human livelihoods perspective, it's also important. So what we're trying to do, as I mentioned, is to put in place support. So I've mentioned the tree cover and the woodlots. We also have cooking stoves that we're supporting through an energy project. So trying to get more efficient fuel usage is another effort we're making. And the electricity access scale-up project, which you may be aware of, is also aiming to get another 1 million people connected to the electricity, and both for grid and off-grid services, to allow people to move gradually away from using non-renewable resources.
And do you actually see the people are graduating from charcoal to electricity? Because it may look very good and sounds very perfect in the books, but in reality, people are not moving, are they?
I would say it's early days, and a lot of effort will be required to make this shift. So it's something that we're hoping to do. There is a project that has been launched last year called Mission 300, which is aiming to connect 300 million Africans to electricity in the next by 2030, and that's a very ambitious agenda, but it has a lot to do with this effort of trying to get alternatives offered. But I would say that a lot of work will be required, both to recover the tree cover. The tree cover is not just being depleted. In fact, I would say maybe less being depleted by refugees and more being depleted by locals who are opening up the land for farming purposes. So that is another sort of risk to the forest cover, and will have to be addressed in some way.
You have put quite some money in the refugee sector, almost $1 billion into that. When you go to Nakivale refugee settlement in Isingiro, you find the best amenities are actually within the settlement than outside the settlement. Some people are envious that the refugees are getting more than the locals in Isingiro. I saw that in Nakivale. So probably you may need to do more, because if the locals start thinking there is more in the settlement than outside the settlement, that is not good.
Absolutely, and this is why the Window for Hosts and Refugees aims to support both the host and the refugees equally. So we are also helping to transition the infrastructure from refugees to the government. So far I think about 50 schools have been transitioned. As you know, we're not the only player in this space. There are lots of humanitarian organizations, development organizations that are providing support for refugees as well, the UN agencies. So we're not the only player in that space. And so the balance of trying to make sure that the investments are made for the refugees and the hosts are a priority now, a growing priority, as we have been talking more recently about the humanitarian development nexus and shifting in line with Uganda's policy away from humanitarian support in the long term to the development support that's required to build this self-reliance that's necessary.
Mukami Kariuki, World Bank Country Manager for Uganda. We're going to take a break, and on the spot, we'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching On the Spot. My name is Patrick Kamara. My guest tonight is the outgoing country World Bank Country Manager for Uganda, Ms. Mukami Kariuki. You know, in 2023, there was the Anti-Homosexuality Act that was passed into law. And I remember at that point, the World Bank, paused funding to Uganda, or ceased funding to Uganda. But, of course, Ugandans are happy you have since resumed funding. Giving support, financial support to Uganda, but the law is still there. So what changed?
So I believe that when you, as you said, we paused funding, in the statement that was issued at that time, we had paused funding in order to allow us to identify what we needed to do to mitigate potential impacts on our projects. So we have worked over the last 2 years with the government to do this. It has been quite extensive work and has required us to really look into the projects. All projects are very different in their nature, as I've mentioned, from forests to education to road construction, and each requiring a different type of action. And so we identified what we call mitigation measures, and we have rolled these mitigation measures out in all of the projects to date, and are including those mitigation measures in projects going forward. So in other words, what we're saying is, for as long as the law is there, we will have to try to ensure that we mitigate against the potential for for discrimination. So it's non-discrimination and inclusion that our policy requires us to ensure that we observe. All funding that comes to the country should be able to benefit all Ugandans, and this is aligned with the constitution of Uganda as well.
It appears that, I don't know what your impression is, it appears that the rights of minorities from the perspective of DC looked like Uganda is hunting down the minorities. It's the worst country to be if you're a minority, sexual minorities. But I don't know what your perspective was really, because here, when you're on the streets of Kampala, you see as if there's nothing. But when you read what is coming from the media outside of Kampala, maybe in DC or London, the perspective is very different. I don't know what brings that.
Yeah, so I would say that we don't have that perspective.
Even though you paused at one point the funding to Uganda because of Anti-Homosexuality Act. Yeah,
the pause was in response to the act and needing to make sure that we had a way to ensure that we would be able to continue to provide the support, as I mentioned, to all Ugandans. And I think, as I said, through the discussions with Uganda's government, and in line with the constitution, we were able to then identify steps that can be taken to ensure that we're really getting those actors who are on the ground, who are more engaged with the population, to understand that everybody must have access to services, and that nobody should be discriminated against. And so that has been the bulk of the effort that we've put in over this time. And as you know, we have policies that support indigenous people. We are providing support to refugees. So we try to make sure that those who may be on the fringes are included and provided additional support where necessary.
As a bank, how do you see Uganda's economic trajectory? How is it performing, and what do you see in the medium term?
So Uganda has maintained very good macroeconomic policies over the last couple of decades, from what I can recall, and this has helped to really allow the country to bounce back fairly quickly whenever there's a crisis. And so you would have noted that after COVID, Uganda was one of the few countries in Africa that were able to really move back quickly into an economic growth trajectory that has been sustained up to this point and continues to improve.
And that is on account of what?
On account of the policies that the government has, maintaining a very, maybe what you say, conservative approach to how they handle borrowing. This is what has been in the past. So preference for concessional financing, I think you hear that a lot from the government, and trying to ensure that inflation is under control. There's a lot more to be done.
Isn't that largely due to Uganda's capability to produce her own food? That is why sometimes, for example, we never suffered, food inflation because we had a lot during COVID. There's a lot of food. Isn't that more really on the peasants who are able to produce than the macroeconomics you're talking about?
So, but I think they go hand in hand.
They do.
Yes, in the sense that obviously if people are feeding themselves and you don't have to feed them, that takes a burden off the fiscus. So I think it's part of the reason, but it is something that we also see that government is now starting to address. Subsistence farming was about 40% of the the economy, and there's been a very deliberate effort, as you've heard, over the last year or so, to move towards getting subsistence farmers into the money economy. And so this is about making sure that taxes are raised sufficiently so that the infrastructure that's required can be built without heavy reliance on external financing, which is starting to diminish over time.
You have a biggest percentage of Uganda's population engaged in agriculture. I don't know whether the bank has been able to find out how much this population contributes to GDP.
Well, it's a tough question because it's not just direct contribution, but there's indirect contributions through industry. So you have, for example, Kakira. Its base is agriculture, but it's producing rum and other products as well. You have many, I think, industries that are deriving their inputs from agriculture. And so I think that the question is that agriculture has been the largest, the point is that agriculture has been the largest contributor towards the economy, but over time this role is diminishing and industry and services are starting to become the bigger sort of contributor to
when the role diminishes in what agriculture is able to give to GDP, the numbers still remain there of the people engaged in the same.
Yes.
But then isn't it also true that you could be having the biggest percentage of your people engaged in a sector that is not contributing as much to the GDP, to GDP?
Yes, and again this goes back to the subsistence issue, that majority of the population, rural population, 40% of the population being in subsistence farming. As you said, they're engaged there, but it does not contribute towards economic growth. So trying to get them to contribute to the economic growth, I think, is one of the agendas, which means moving to cash crops and moving to more sort of agro-processing type of activities that allow value addition to the produce that's coming out of the rural areas. So there's a lot to be done there. We were talking just yesterday about coffee and the fact that Uganda is now the largest coffee producer on the continent. And I was noting that I had heard that it's very difficult to find containers these days because all the containers are being hunted for by coffee exporters. So that means the volumes of exports are high, but it doesn't mean that you're getting full value for your coffee. And so there's a lot more to be done to make sure that you go from just exporting raw beans to exporting finished products.
If we engage into agricultural production, is this country assured of a sustainable market in the region? Because look, there's the Africa Intercontinental Trade Free Area, but I wonder whether that has been taken advantage of, because if you do not have a market and you're assured of a sustainable market, you can't get to production, can you?
Yes, absolutely. That's the very, very critical point. You are also landlocked or land-linked, depending on how you want to see it. And so having neighbors that and buyers within the region is one thing. Having access to the ports and export opportunities is another one. And I think there's an effort going on now to try to resolve some of these issues in terms of getting the railway in place. But there's also a lot of effort and interest in trying to trade across borders. I don't think the Africa Free Continental Trade Area has adequately been supported, and there are many reasons why it may not have taken off in the way that we would have liked to see it take off. So I think there's a lot more work to be done to understand that particular opportunity.
One of them could be logistics or infrastructure?
It could be, yes. I did see recently that there are milk exports going to the Middle East. That's a new effort.
Algeria.
Mm-hmm. So I said the Middle East, I should have said North Africa, sorry. So we have Middle East and North Africa in our nomenclature. So yes, so these are the types of things that need to be really given more attention. And I think that there is an opportunity for Uganda to identify certain crops that it will export to the rest of the continent, and to work with these countries to ensure that the standards are met. Typically the standards not being met for export of crops is one of the big barriers.
I'm talking about standards. There was a time when Uganda could not export her maize to South Sudan because they didn't find it fit for human consumption. And yes, the Sudanese deserve better. But if South Sudan is going to say, we don't want your maize, then you know we have really fallen short. And also there's a time when Kenya could not accept Ugandan milk because they thought actually this milk is not from Uganda. They had to send a delegation to come and find out if the milk is actually from here. And there's a time when President Yoweri Museveni had to go and beg the Kenyan government to buy Ugandan sugar. So I think there's a problem with the markets.
So I think that it's a problem of negotiating trade agreements across the borders, and maybe less trade agreements and more standards. There is a project which the IFC was supporting, which was to help get the Kenyan and the Ugandan authorities together on the maize standards, for them to sit in a room and try to work through what is required for maize to be of a quality that's acceptable. So these types of efforts are very important because you can have the trade deal, but if the standards are not met and if the technical people are not comfortable with the agreements that have been reached, then you don't get the outcomes that are desired.
Has the World Bank been supporting the issue of standards and value addition?
Yes, we have. We actually worked quite extensively with the entities that do business registration, licensing, development of standards. We are continuing to do that. So I'm sure you are aware of the center that has been constructed within proximity of this building that provides a one-stop shop for all businesses to register, to get licenses, to get all the documentation that's required for them to function. So we do provide that type of financing as well.
When you listen to the government officials, they say we have reached the middle income status. How do you rank us as World Bank?
So for us, I think we have a global approach to the way that the middle income status is defined, and so I wouldn't want to comment on it extensively at this point, but Uganda is on the way, as the government has been saying, to middle income, reaching middle income status. And I think if more is done to really inject the capital that's required to get this economy really moving along at a much more rapid speed, I think then you can get there more quickly. So at this point, on our books and based on our numbers, we still have some way to go, but obviously the trajectory, as I mentioned, is good, and if it's possible to sustain growth rates of between 8 and 10%, you may be able to get there faster. So I believe it's at about 6.5 at the moment, 6.5% the growth rate of the but I think there's more to be done.
But if the 6.5 or 7% growth rate, the figures looks admirable, looks incredible, but the people don't feel it. Like, we don't see the transformation that can correlate with the 7% growth rate.
Yes. So
and yet, if that growth rate was in another country, you'd see tremendous change. So what's wrong with us?
Nothing is wrong with you, but I think there is more to be done to really translate these benefits down to especially out to the rural areas. A subsistence farmer will not feel the 7% growth rate because they're not participating in the economic activity, which then sort of allows them to see that impact. So unless you get them into a position where they're farming, they're producing goods, they're selling them, they're earning income, and they're able then to plow this back into their farms or to purchase a tractor, then they stay sort of at this subsistent level. So I think a lot of it has to do with the necessary tools to get that done. Others are access to finance, and we've worked quite extensively with the Ministry of Lands to try to get the land administration system set up such that titling allows you to then go to a bank and borrow. So there are all these steps that have to be taken, which we have been trying to support, which will require a lot more effort to get there, but which are seeing good steady progress and benefits to the country already.
But really, let's face it, if there are people in Western Uganda growing tomato, growing onions and greens and all these kind of things, even if they increase in the volume, and there's no way how these agricultural products have a market outside of Uganda, they're not going to uplift each other, will they?
They would uplift each other if they look for opportunities internally. For example, tourism is one of the sectors which is growing fairly rapidly. Government is expecting to see 25-fold growth. That's quite an ambitious target, but it can be helped by having these types of arrangements made where the farmers are now turning some of that produce into contributions towards the industries at their local areas, or the tourism sort of industry within their local area.
The government has an ambitious plan of a tenfold growth of the economy to be a $500 billion economy in 10 years. It's ambitious, yes, but just do you see that feasible? Is it likely to happen?
It is up to you, as people of Uganda,
as economists, as people who look at the trends and have tracked Uganda for the last so many years.
I would say that it's quite an ambitious target, but it's necessary to be ambitious in order to get somewhere. What needs to be done, as I mentioned, the sound macroeconomic policies are a critical part of it, but along with that are policies to help the private sector to really be able to move quite steadily forward. Right now, majority of the private sector players are in the micro and small enterprise phase, so trying to really push them forward, allow them to grow to medium and large enterprise level, I think would be a very important next step. I think Uganda has the largest number of enterprises on the continent, maybe, and so it's important to give them the support that's required for them to then contribute towards those targets. So targets are important, but policies are going to be critical, and follow through in terms of implementation of those policies to allow the results to show, I think, will be critical as well.
Uganda has the highest number of enterprises, but I also I hope you know that these enterprises die quite often.
Yes.
The mortality rate of enterprises is high.
Yeah, I think that's a standard that's, how do you say, global, in the sense that maybe 4 out of every 10 enterprises, or even less than 10, do not survive. And a lot of it has to do with the supporting environment. So this is why I'm saying it's important to provide them the support that they require in terms of access to finance, but other goods and services as well. We are funding a project called GROW and another one called Invite. Invite is facing the export industry and trying to see how to make sure that if they need funding with terms that allow them to build a factory, allow them to export goods and services, that is provided. And the GROW project is aiming at the other end at micro and small enterprise and focusing on women entrepreneurs to help them to have the access to the inputs that are required. So this is not just money, it's also childcare, it's support for women's platforms, it's support for training, incubators. So really trying to look at what it is that the women were lacking that stopped them from moving from micro enterprise to small and medium level, and allowing those things to be available.
So this money in GROW is coming in as loans, right?
It's actually we provided 100% grant for the GROW project, but part of that funding is going through the banks for those enterprises that are bankable, to try and make sure that we support them, because obviously one of the factors in growing is to be able to be bankable. But for those who cannot go to the bank, there is support being provided through micro enterprise and SACCOs, and that funding is allowing that. The rest of the funding is for, as I said, the incubators, the training programs, and other things as well. So out of the $200 million that was provided for GROW, 40 is for the loans through the banks, and the rest of it is actually for all of these other activities. It's a very big program, ambitious program, and hopefully we'll begin to see the results of that program.
Are there women who have taken these loans who are now beginning to pay back?
Yes, they are. Some of them have already paid back, and the loans are being, provided to others. So that is already happening.
Whom are you actually targeting with these loans? What kind of women?
So the ones that go through the banks are targeted to women who have collateral and who are micro enterprise level or small enterprise level. So to a large extent, it's any woman who has a business that has been functioning for at least 3 years and is viable and has the collateral to then support them. So, and this, as I said, the aim there is to really build a relationship with the bank so that after the project is over, they have the steady and sustainable resources required.
I wonder what kind of collateral you're talking about, because if you're talking about land, largely women are tilling the land they don't own in Uganda.
Yes, so as I said, there's several windows. So the window that is collateral based is for the bigger, more settled, maybe more urban enterprises. And for those who haven't got access to land, then they have support through the micro enterprise and the SACCO support that's also being extended. Okay.
There has been cases of human rights violations by the state and in Uganda, especially for those who are in the political opposition. When you give money to a country that is also facing allegations of human rights violation, don't you find yourselves conflicted?
As I said, Uganda is a member of the World Bank, and we support all our member states. We are set up through our members as a non-political organization. So our goal is to work for the good of the people. And yes, to the extent that there are conflicts, we are affected, but our job is to try to really work with the government to try and do what can be done to make sure that economic development happens. And for that to happen, often the policy framework that allows for growth needs to be a positive one. So we hope that by working with the government and with the people of the country, we're able to make these strides.
And with the rise of the East, I'm talking about China, you know, providing support, loans, and sometimes also grants. Do you, at World Bank headquarters, are you now looking at some of support to the third world in a different prism? That you have a competitor in China, and it is making some of the African countries and other third world countries a little bullish?
Well, as I said, we're an organization of 180 members. China is one of them. China is actually still a borrower from the bank, so they actually also benefit from the IBRD loans, and they use them strategically to help to have used them and continue to use them strategically to help them to make progress at national level. So we encourage all types of partnerships. They're all very useful. The level of exports from Uganda to China and the Far East, if that could increase, that would be a good plus, positive for the country, and it's something that we would welcome. I think what we'd hope that we can also do is to try to encourage the country to be very selective in the loans that it takes, to make sure that when funds are borrowed at terms that are not concessional, those are for projects which then return those funds as quickly as possible. So they generate the income to allow the repayment of those loans as quickly as possible.
Is our debt level something should be concerned us? Because some people are really scared that we are hitting a level that could get us into a debt trap.
At this point, Uganda, as I mentioned, has a good macroeconomic framework, and the fiscal situation is sustainable. After COVID, you had a moderate level of debt distress. So I think that has been maintained up to this point. It is a number to watch, and I think that, as I said, it would be important to watch especially the debt that is borrowed on non-concessional terms, and which may be piling up the need for repayments much faster than the funds that are received from us.
After 4 years of your tour of duty in Uganda coming to an end, where is Mukami headed?
Mukami is headed first to Nairobi, where our new Africa East Vice Presidency has recently moved. We now have both the Vice President for the World Bank and for the IFC based in Nairobi. So I'll be there for a while, and then from there I will determine where I will move next.
You have become a true global citizen, haven't you?
Absolutely.
What's going to be your concluding remark tonight?
My concluding remark, I think, would be that it is really critical to really move at speed. In this time when we see the global aid architecture changing quite significantly, there will be a need for much more local resilience, much more local or domestic resource mobilization, and so it will be necessary for Ugandans to try to find a way to really pick up more of the costs of development over time. So this will require much more adherence to the policies that you have. Uganda has quite good policies in place in most sectors, and to continue to identify those policies that can then allow you to make more progress, and actions, as you said, which will help the trajectory, the growth trajectory, to be even more steep.
Mukami Kariuki, outgoing World Bank Country Manager for Uganda, thank you so much for having your time to have had time to talk to us.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me today, and good luck with the next decade. I think it's going to be a very exciting one. Thank you.
Mukami Kariuki, they are ending on an optimistic trajectory for Uganda's economy. And that brings us to the end of tonight's edition of On the Spot. Join us again next week, same time, same station. Good night, and God bless Uganda.